Looking forward to this very exciting panel. We have three speakers on very interesting topics, certainly as far as I'm concerned. The first is our host, Shiva Mihan, a postdoc fellow in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Her work focuses on Perso-Islamic arts of the book from the 13th to the 19th century. She received her PhD in Persian Studies from Cambridge in 2018, and her dissertation, Timurid Manuscript Production, the Scholarship and Aesthetics of Prince Baysunghur's Royal Library, was awarded the Lee Douglas Memorial Prize by the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. Her forthcoming book on manuscript production in Timurid Iran will soon be published by Edinburgh University Press. And she is, of course, also the founding president of the Persian Manuscripts Association. So it's my pleasure to ask Shiva to tell us about Baysunghur's Rasayil, a digital reconstruction of a mutilated manuscript.
All right, good morning, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. As the title of my presentation suggests, I'm going to discuss the reconstruction of a mutilated Timurid manuscript. It's been several years that I've been working on dispersed folios and manuscripts, and some of my publications and projects are dedicated to digital reconstruction of manuscripts. One of the cases that I studied is an exquisite manuscript from the library of no other than Prince Baysunghur. To start with, I will introduce the manuscript first, very briefly, and I talk about the textual content and physical features, and then I will draw your attention to the signs of dismemberment. The question I'll try to answer is, would it be possible to digitally reconstruct the original codex as it was presented to the prince nearly 600 years ago? This elegantly illuminated manuscript was copied in 1427, and it contains 7 rare treatises, 7 illuminated headings, and 7 high-quality illustrations. It was copied by the royal scribe Shams al-Sultani, the prince's calligraphy tutor, who receives the sobriquet Baysunghuri a year afterward, in 1428. And we see that he signs as Shams al-Baysunghuri in the manuscript of Humayun, which is now in the National Library in Vienna. He is the only Baysunghuri scribe besides Jafar, who was the head of the library. And based on evidence, they had similar levels of influence and power. This manuscript was known as Rasayil, meaning treatises, as stated in his colophon. But none of the previous studies had identified the title until 2001, when Gavin Bailey referred to it as Al-Rasayil, but he suggested the translation, the letters, but we don't have any letters here. Therefore, like many other manuscripts, it is still known by the name of its collector, the Berenson Anthology. The bulk of the manuscript is now housed in the Bernard Berenson collection in Villa Itati in Florence, Italy, which is now the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. In 2015, I studied this manuscript at Biblioteca Berenson as part of my PhD research on the scholarship and aesthetics of Prince Baysunghur's library. And during my examination, which took a couple of hours maybe, I noticed signs of mutilation on this manuscript, which appear to have gone entirely unnoticed for over a century since Bernard Berenson purchased his manuscript in 1910. There has been several studies discussing this manuscript. Ettinghausen in Persian Miniatures in the Berenson collection discussed this manuscript in 1961. Piemontese published a comprehensive codicological studies in 1984, which is the best study of this manuscript, among others. And Thomas Lenz, in his PhD dissertation, discusses this manuscript, but he never had the chance to go and see this manuscript in the Princeton library, so he relies on others' accounts. Eleanor Sims, in her precious book, Peerless Images, only discusses a few paintings of this manuscript. Then we have Kasari, Bailey, Suchek, Ettinghausen. All of them did pivotal work on this manuscript, more concentrated on the paintings, but none of these studies had identified all the correct titles of the treatises, and none of them spotted or pointed out the signs of mutilation. I should mention that the Harvard Art Museums had an exhibition showcasing this manuscript in 2017, and it was a year before I joined Harvard, and the publication is not out yet, but hopefully very soon. So I'm not aware of the content of recent contributions. My study has been completely independent and was included in my thesis in 2018. Now let's go back to the manuscript. The title Rasayil is found in a unique Timurid document entitled the Arzadasht, meaning petition or report. This document gives unique insights about the ongoing projects on artistic and architectural activities of the atelier. And it was written by Jafar Baysunghur, who was the head of the atelier, supervisor of all these activities in White Garden or Bagh Safid in Herat. That was the residential palace for the prince. And it is now kept in Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. It's one folio, but here I split it in two parts so we can see the whole thing. The single folio document is not dated, but Wheeler Thaxton and David Roxburgh suggest the date around 1430. But I tend to agree with Ahad Parsai, who suggested 1427. I've demonstrated that based on the manuscript that are mentioned here and the manuscript that are not mentioned here, the colophon of the manuscript that we have and the historical events, it was written in July of 1427 when the Rasayil was in production. This is probably the year that Baysunghur's atelier started illustrating manuscripts. Before this date, we do not find any manuscripts with illustrations. And probably the first two codices to be illustrated, and which are mentioned also too, in the Arzadasht were the Golestan of Saadi, now in Chasabiti Library, and the Rasayil. The first paragraph reports on the progress of two sea scenes in the Golestan, which was done by Amir Khalid. And in this paragraph, in blue brackets, we read, Khaja Qiyasuddin has progressed in two scenes of the Rasayil to the point of working on the faces. And he's also busy with two architectural scenes that were rejected from the Golestan. So now we know the name of two artists that were working on these two manuscripts. In addition to the textual content of the Rasayil, the author of each treatise was previously either have not been identified or they were misidentified. So I needed to study the text from the beginning, and I located other copies of each treatise and prepared the edition for each of these texts. In my limited time here, I'm not going through the details, so I'll just mention the titles that appear in this manuscript, and then I will focus on the physical features. So the 7 treatises that are in Rasayil include Golomol, the Rose and the Wine, Nushatul Ashiqin, Lover's Delight, Tigh Qalam, the Sword and the Pen, Rasale Chang, the Treatise of Harp, Rasale Rabi'iyeh, Treatise of Spring, Nardu Shatranj, Backgammon and Chess, Rasale Sirajiyeh, Treatise of the Lamp. This is the last treatise. And as you see, they have sumptuously illuminated headings, and they intertextual decorations look very much like the Golestan manuscript in the Chesapeake. As I mentioned, it was being produced at the same time as Rasayil. This is one of the scenes of the Golestan of Saadi. We know that the Golestan of Saadi has 8 chapters. The Rasayil has 7 chapters. They have the same number of illustrations, the same number of folios, and very similar dimensions. It is quite possible that the same artists were working on both of these manuscripts. From the Arzadosh, we learned that Ghiyasuddin was working on the architectural scenes and Amir Khalil on the sea scenes. So they were the responsible painters. We can compare 2 architectural scenes from these 2 manuscripts. This one is Lady offering drink to Saadi from the Golestan, and the lover below the lady's window from the Rasayil. As you might spot, they have similar layout and settings, and they have similar compositions where every element is located. They have used similar motifs and visual elements in both of these, and the relation between text and image are also similar. But another similarity between these 2 works is that one chapter in each of these manuscripts contain the most number of illustrations. In the Manner of Kings in the Golestan and the Lover's Delight in the Rasayil, each of them have 4 or 5 out of 7 illustrations. This is another illustration from the Rasayil, depicts the backgammon and chess debate, and it's been regarded by previous scholars as the finest illustration of the entire manuscript. It's not my most favorite one, but it's quite beautiful. The golden sky is a trademark of the Timurid manuscripts, and we see that it is in contrast with this red rhythm of the balustrade here. And it seems like Baysunghur really liked the subject. Chess represents reason, and backgammon represents the role of chance and fate in life. And we know that Baysunghur was a fatalist. So this scene was probably one of his favorites. And we see that it was repeated also in the most famous Baysunghuri manuscript, the Shahnameh at the Golestan Palace in Tehran. And in the year 1427, it was at the beginning of copying and decorating of the Shahnameh manuscript. Although the Rasayil looks pristine at first glance, when I examined the manuscript, I found signs of mutilation, and I found that some folios were loose in the gutter, showing that there was something going on with the manuscript. And then I noticed the traces of internal damage. Almost every folio with a heading, which marks the beginning of each treatise, had creases, wrinkles, or even tiny air bubbles like this one in the picture. And when I used a LED light, I saw that the damage was even worse than what I thought. And it was indicating that the folios had been split at some point. I suspected a decorated medallion or shamse had been removed from the beginning of each section by splitting the paper. What I mean by splitting is a delicate operation in which they separate the recto and verso of a folio using a sharp blade. It's like peeling, I would say, peeling a sticker from its support. This hypothesis was so strengthened when I found an imprint of such shamse here at the beginning of backgammon and chess. So it was visible even without backlighting. You can see the details, and the tiny air bubbles are also showing here. The only person who have noticed this imprint was Basil Gray. He mentioned that there is this imprint, but he doesn't take it any further. He doesn't have any conclusion of that. And so the Vandals wanted to hide the traces of this dismemberment. So they pasted a thin sheet of paper on the reverse of each folio to make it more solid. And one of these folios is pasted over by a watermarked paper. This European watermark paper was in manufacturing around the mid of 17th century, I would say around 1640 to 1650. And it was in production for almost a century. And perhaps that is the earliest we can think of this mutilation happening. It has happened probably around this time. Now, you might ask, what happened to all those shamses that were butchered from this manuscript? And are they possibly extant? That's where it gets exciting. I immediately started a search on this manuscript, and I was wondering if I could find these missing folios. And because I knew the text and I had studied it, I knew the correct titles to look for. So I started the search, and I was amazed to find a Christies Auction describing a Timurid manuscript with 4 shamses, which was sold in London in 2009. I started a lengthy mediated correspondence with Christies and with the owner of this manuscript, and the owner contacted me, and you can imagine how happy I was to understand that this manuscript was owned by Mr. Sudovar, who is a well-known scholar and comes from a lineage of collectors and benevolent donors. So in my next trip to Tehran, I examined the shamses, which are now located in Tehran. And as you see, this shamse reflects the imprint. It is exactly the same thing. And actually the inscriptions on these 4 shamses were exactly the same as the titles of 4 treatises. And I was sure that I have found 4 out of 7 of these missing folios. But one of these shamses were particularly interesting to me. The shamse of the Rasayil Rabi'iyya. The inner circle, this bit, in this manuscript, in this shamse, is exact duplicate of the title shamse of the Kailo Demne. And superimposing the 2 shows that they even use the same stencil, although the color palette is different. So the similarity in the aesthetic of these 2 shamses led me to hypothesize that they had a similar program for illumination and illustration and decorating the manuscript. And that was supported by the fact that these 2 manuscripts were both copied by the same scribe, Shams al-Baysunghuri. So I looked at these manuscripts. The intertextual illuminations were also the same, very similar. So I thought that maybe the Rasayil also had a double page illustration, which appears at the beginning of the Kailo Demne, and then an illuminated ex libris. So this is a double page illustration that appears at the beginning of the Kailo Demne, showing the prince drinking while musicians performing. That is the typical of the illustrations that we find at the beginning of each Baysunghuri manuscript, if they have one. We know that he loved drinking. He was always depicted with this bowl of wine in his hand, and he died because of excessive use of wine at the age of 35, actually. So could the Rasayil also have a double page illustration? We can't be certain, but there is a double page painting in the Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C., which depicts a young prince in a similar setting. The prince is drinking and the musicians are playing. I speculate that it might belong to Rasayil because the dimensions are matching. And apart from that, in the first treatise, which is a debate between the rose and the wine boasts of its place in the hand of the kings, and the wine wins the debate. The story is reflected in this painting. We see that the prince is drinking, and the flower, depicted in 4 places in the middle, is finally broken and looking down, almost directly above the bowl of wine. But we can't be sure yet. I think it needs a little bit more investigation. I'm convinced, but it's probably not a convincing discussion yet. So also we can see the traces of splitting around the papers. It needs more evidence to firmly associate it with the Rasayil manuscript. After the frontispiece illustration in the Galileo Demne, we have this beautiful double page illumination. That is the ex libris of the manuscript, and the inscription suggests that it was ordered by the prince to be copied and illustrated. The Rasayil could have such an ex libris, a double page illuminated in this format, probably. And I tried to locate it and I was successful. So I found that it exists as 2 folios in the Chesapeake Library. And these 2 folios were long considered to have been part of a lost manuscript of Prince Baysunghur. And the manuscript was, the catalog of Chesapeake suggests that it was Arabic proverbs and sayings, apparently on the basis of the inscription that appears here. As Maria mentioned yesterday with the Nasaya Iskandar, the titles given by the Chesapeake catalog are sometimes misleading. And when I studied this, I saw that the actual meaning of the inscription is that the prince ordered the transcription and edition of these treatises, and also he commanded this manuscript to be copied and illustrated. I think it sort of emphasizes the value and rarity of the treatises at that time. I should also mention that the only Baysunghuri ex librises in this format are the Galileo Demne and the Rasayil. Other manuscripts bear a shamse, like a round medallion or a cusp medallion within a blank page. So there is nothing surrounding those shamses, but this one is different. Sorry, I would like to talk about a probable time that this mutilation happened. So the manuscript was purchased by Bernard Berenson from someone with the pseudonym Claude Anet in 1910 from Paris. And the Sudavar album containing 4 of the Shamses were purchased in 2009 from someone called Jafar Ghazi or Ghazizadeh. He was a well-known collector of Persian manuscripts, and he died in 2007. But according to Christies, it was purchased probably in Istanbul. The exact date the illuminated folios acquired by Chesapeake are not known, but we know that they were there since 1938, and they were probably purchased around the 1920s. And the detached double page illustration was acquired by Martin in 1912. And in a short amount of time, they were passed between all these collectors until it ended up in Sackler Gallery. But we have a date, an inscription at the back of those two folios with the date 1867, which suggests that maybe that was the latest time that this mutilation had happened. So I'm going to share the reconstruction of the manuscript. Okay, this is a Baysunghur binding. The actual binding of the manuscript is a 19th century Ottoman velvet binding. This is a binding for Nasaya Iskandar that is one of the original bindings of the manuscript. This is a doublure. And if we accept that Sackler Gallery illustration was part of this manuscript, it would have looked like something like this at the beginning, and then followed by the Chester Beatty double page illuminated ex libris. Then we could proceed to a Shamse, which I was not successful to find, this one. And the text started with a preface and an illuminated heading, and then one of the treatises. So if we bring back the pseudo Shamses into the manuscript, we can see that it might have looked like this one. This is one of the Shamses. And then we have the illuminated heading and illustration. This is a very short treatise. The next one also from Sudawar's collection. And the last one. And this is the colophon of the manuscript. And Sila by Yusuf II in the end of the manuscript.